Welcome to the last of our 4 episodes on the thrilling series by W. James Blantyre, chronicling the perilous adventures of the intrepid Dr. Tan in the uncharted Amazon. Get ready to plunge into the mystery of the Amazon's thrilling reptilian secret. Let's dive in. The jungle was slow to exhale. The oppressive silence that had gripped the forest began to lift, cautiously, like an animal peeking from its burrow after a predator has passed. Somewhere deep in the tangled greenery, a lone bird let out a hesitant chirp, followed by another, then a distant trill. The normal sounds of life, crickets, frogs, the subtle patter of leaves shifting in the breeze, began to return, stitching the rainforest's fragile tapestry of sound back together. But it felt wrong, like a painting hastily repaired after being torn down the middle. We decided to cross the river to investigate. On the other side, we both jumped out the canoe. Mateo was already moving. His machete hung loosely in his trembling hand, while his other hand pressed firmly against his chest, as if trying to anchor himself in the waking nightmare. He stepped cautiously toward the patch of scorched earth where the craft landed, now reduced to little more than a blackened scar on the forest floor. Wisps of smoke curled upward, carrying the faint tang of ozone. His boots crunched softly over crystallized soil, the faint residual glow still clinging stubbornly to the earth. I forced myself to follow, though every cell in my body resisted. My legs felt hollow, my breath shallow. Rational thought tried to stitch itself back together, but the events of the last hour left cracks in my mind, wide enough to swallow logic whole. The clearing was devastation-made art, perfect in its precision, unnatural in its sterility. The vegetation hadn't been burned by fire, nor had it been flattened by any discernible force. It had unraveled, as though the very molecular bonds of the plants had been loosened and left to collapse in slow motion. Mateo crouched, his face creased with fear and something deeper, awe, maybe, or dread. He reached out and touched the remains of a broad-leafed plant, its edges fused into glass-like filaments, brittle and alien. "Dios mío," he whispered. I said nothing. Words felt irrelevant here, like trying to explain thunder to someone who had only ever seen rain. My gaze fixed on something just beyond him, prints in the mud. Not the prints of the 2 creatures that had left with the craft. Those were there too, clear and distinct. But they were different, smaller, more humanoid, leading toward the craft's launch site. And then there were the others, larger, more animalistic, more predatory. These tracks came from the launch site. They led toward the riverbank, but then stopped. Deep clawed impressions gouged into the earth, heavy and deliberate. Whatever made them was weighty yet balanced, its movements purposeful yet alien. The prints weren't faded or disrupted by the water. They just ended, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air mid-step. How was this possible? We never saw a third creature exit the craft, or anywhere near it. Was it cloaking itself somehow? Some form of camouflage? And could this creature be connected to the strange pod we'd seen earlier in the forest, embedded in mud? My mind raced, connecting fragments of sense and nonsense, spiraling into confusion and speculation. Mateo followed my line of sight and froze. His machete dipped slightly, the blade trembling in his grip. Where did it go?" I whispered, though the words came out choked and hollow. Mateo shook his head, his lips thin and bloodless. "No animal leaves tracks like that, Doctor, and no animal disappears into thin air." Above us, the jungle canopy swayed softly, betraying no trace of the craft's departure or the creatures that had emerged from it. Whatever they had been doing here, it felt finished. But finished how? Was it a completed mission, a retrieval, a warning? The possibilities coiled tight in my stomach, each one more nauseating than the last. I forced myself to stand, wiping my trembling hands on the damp fabric of my pants. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle. Mateo didn't argue. We walked back to the canoe, though every sound, the crunch of a leaf, the rustle of fabric, felt exaggerated, like the forest itself was listening. At one point, Mateo froze mid-motion, his head snapping sharply toward a patch of shadow beneath a gnarled tree root. I followed his gaze, my stomach knotting, my body primed to flee. But there was nothing. just darkness and the faint outline of tangled roots. Still, neither of us relaxed. We were being watched. I was sure of it. Whether by those creatures, their craft, or something else entirely. I couldn't say, but I felt it. In the air, in the fine hairs at the back of my neck, in the cold itch creeping up my spine. By the time we pushed the canoe back into the current of the river, neither of us spoke. The gentle lap of water against the hull became our sole companion as the canoe drifted deeper into the darkness. Mateo sat rigid at the bow, eyes scanning the tree line, like he expected something to lunge out of the shadows at any moment. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to glance back at the fading glow of the clearing. Whatever had happened there, whatever we had seen, touched, felt, was burned into me, etched into the fragile framework of my sanity. But the prints remained in my mind, gnawing at the edges of my reason. If they simply stopped, then where had the creature gone? And more chilling still, was it still here? Somewhere in the dense tangle of green and shadow, just beyond sight, watching us? For a man of science, a man who had spent decades clinging to measurable truths, data, samples, patterns, this moment felt like the erosion of a foundation I had taken for granted my entire life. Because now, as the river narrowed into a winding ribbon of black glass, as the moon's light fractured into shards against the surface of the water, I felt something I could neither measure nor explain. A presence. A whispering, unknowable weight pressing against my mind, heavy with the suggestion that we were not alone. And though my heart screamed for answers, though every rational part of me itched to catalog and categorize the events of the past day, there was another voice, a quieter, colder voice that urged caution. Because some answers should never be found, and some truths are best left buried in the dark. The outpost appeared around a bend in the river, clinging to the muddy bank like an afterthought. Wooden structures leaned at precarious angles, held together by stubborn nails and sheer determination. Smoke curled lazily from a distant cook fire, and the faint murmur of human voices felt strangely alien after days swallowed by oppressive silence. Mateo spotted it first, his shoulders sagging with a relief so palpable I almost felt it myself. The canoe bumped softly against the pier, the dull thud reverberating through my chest. A barefoot boy, wide-eyed and hesitant, stared at us for a moment before turning and sprinting toward one of the huts. I caught my reflection in the water, hollow eyes, streaks of mud smearing my face, a weariness that felt etched into my bones. Mateo looked no better, his face lined with exhaustion, his clothes clinging damply to his frame. Climbing out of the canoe felt like crossing an invisible boundary, a transition back to reality, or something resembling it. My boots sank into the sodden planks of the dock, and I inhaled deeply. The air here still carried the jungle's humidity, but the weight was different, less predatory, less suffocating. For a fleeting moment, I considered collapsing right there on the dock and letting the river carry away everything we'd seen. But Mateo's voice dragged me back. "We tell them nothing, Doctor," he said, his voice low but firm. "They'll think we've lost our minds." I nodded, though the words felt like gravel in my throat. How does one explain lights that bent reality, metallic pods etched with alien symbols, or creatures that moved like liquid shadows? How does one make the impossible sound plausible? We walked into the heart of the outpost, our arrival drawing curious, wary glances. The people here were used to travelers, scientists, traders, wanderers, but they weren't used to us. They weren't used to eyes that had seen something beyond the boundary of comprehension. A woman handed Mateo a battered tin cup of water, which he downed in 2 desperate gulps. I took mine slower, letting the cold liquid soothe my parched throat, though it did nothing to ease the knot of tension lodged somewhere deep inside me. Someone asked where we'd come from. Mateo muttered vague mentions of dangerous rapids and wild animals. They accepted the explanation easily. After all, the jungle is a devouring thing, swallowing men every year. But their eyes lingered on us longer than they should have, sensing something unspoken. That night, as I lay on a rickety cot in a corner of an open hut, I stared up at the slats in the wooden ceiling, listening to distant laughter, the creak of beams shifting under weight, and the slow lapping of water against the pier. For the first time in days, I wasn't surrounded by ancient trees or suffocating silence. Yet sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, slitted eyes glinting with emerald light, clawed footprints halting mid-step, and the fluid, predatory grace of something that had looked at me and understood. I rose before dawn. The river stretched endlessly into the distance, its surface glassy and impenetrable, the pale blush of morning light creeping over the horizon. Mateo was already there, perched on the edge of the dock, a hand-rolled cigarette smoldering between his fingers. He said nothing as I approached, only gestured with a nod toward the edge of the clearing. There, etched into the bark of a nearby tree, was an imprint. 5 long, clawed digits pressed deeply into the wood. The grooves were sharp-edged and glistened faintly with some residue that caught the light, a sickly sheen that looked almost metallic. I stepped closer, feeling that now familiar weight press against my chest, that sensation of being watched, measured, considered. "Do you think they're still here?" I asked softly. Mateo took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember flaring briefly in the dim light. He exhaled smoke in a slow, steady stream, his eyes fixed on the tree trunk. "Does it matter?" he replied, his voice steady but low. "They'll come back, Doctor. They always do." We stood there in silence for a long while, watching the jungle stretch out endlessly behind us, inscrutable and infinite. As the first hints of sunrise painted the river in muted gold, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a faint ripple in the water, a distortion just beneath the glassy surface. For one brief, maddening moment, I thought I saw something glimmering below, 2 faintly glowing eyes staring back at me, unblinking before vanishing into the depths. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps it was paranoia, or perhaps they were still watching. When we finally departed the outpost later that day, I left behind my soil samples, my water pH records, and my carefully annotated notebook. None of it felt important anymore. Whatever we had witnessed existed beyond data points and specimen jars. Some knowledge, some truths, aren't meant to be cataloged. Back in my office, far from the humid choke of the jungle, I still feel it. The weight of those eyes, the faint echo of that green light flickering against the edge of my vision, and some nights, when the air is perfectly still and the sky is clear, I swear I see it again. A faint pulse of emerald on the horizon, like a beacon calling across the void, and I wonder, not for the first time, if we made it out at all. Thanks for joining us on this eerie journey. If this story sent chills down your spine, make sure to hit the like button. Let us know your thoughts, or if you've had any strange encounters in the comments below. We love hearing your stories. Don't forget to subscribe for more mysterious and otherworldly tales. And make sure to click the bell icon so you never miss a new upload. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching the skies.